The whispers follow her through Cedar Creek Medical's ICU like a fog that settles but never lifts. Just a nurse. That's what their eyes say when Brooke Sullivan passes the nursing station at shift change. Not the competence. Not the precise way her hands move across monitor screens. Not the fact that she caught a medication error 3 days ago that would have killed a patient. Just a nurse. Dr. Pierce hasn't arrived yet, but his absence is louder than his presence. By 0600 hours, it will be everywhere. The ICU smells like antiseptic and desperation under fluorescent lights that hum at a frequency that lives in your bones after the 3rd hour of a shift. Brooke has been here 11 months. She knows every hum, every beep, every mechanical breath the ventilators take. She knows which monitors lag by half a second. She knows which poles have wheels that stick if you don't turn them counterclockwise first. She knows room 347 in her sleep. 9-year-old Colonel Garrett lies motionless in room 347, his small frame dwarfed by adult ICU equipment designed for bodies twice his size. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm into the boy's lungs. Monitors surrounded him like sentries keeping vigil over something already decided as lost. 3 weeks ago, an IED outside Bagram Airfield took his mother. Dylan was supposed to be safe in the rear compound. Children weren't supposed to be there. Children definitely weren't supposed to survive the blast with a traumatic brain injury that caused 7 attending physicians to gather in a conference room and sign withdrawal of care recommendations in black ink that looked like a death sentence. Colonel Marcus Garrett sits rigid in the visitor's chair beside his son's bed, uniform still crisp despite the 18-hour flights from Germany and the 3 days he's spent watching his only child breathe because machines force the oxygen in. The green beret patch on his shoulder carries weight that most people never understand. He grips Dylan's hand like he's holding the last thing tethering him to the earth. His calloused fingers look enormous against his son's small wrist. Brooke has watched him sit there for 72 consecutive hours, breaking only for water he doesn't drink and bathroom visits he takes like they're betrayals. She enters room 347 with the medication cart at 0530 hours, before the day shift fully arrives, before the physicians make their rounds, before the whispers have time to build their wall. Her movements are economical, each action flowing from the last like water finding its path downhill. She wears navy scrubs with a slight limp favoring her left leg. Faint scars visible at her collarbone when she leans forward to adjust Dylan's central line. She doesn't acknowledge the colonel. Acknowledgement requires words, and words require explanation, and explanation is dangerous territory for someone who doesn't belong. Colonel Garrett watches her work with the intensity of a man who has been trained to notice details that kill people if you miss them. He sees the way she checks the ventilator settings without looking at the display, she already knows what they are. He sees her fingers find a pressure point on Dylan's neck, checking the carotid pulse, her expression shifting microscopically as she processes information from his body. She writes something in the chart. For sentences. Her handwriting is precise as a blueprint. Brooke documents subtle neurological responses that the night shift nurses have missed or chose not to record. At 0347 hours, Dylan's pupils responded to light with a millisecond delay, a not brain-dead reflex, actual processing. At 0412 hours, his left hand tensed when the ambient temperature dropped as night gave way to early morning. Minor signs. Barely measurable. The kind of thing you only catch if you've learned to read bodies the way other people read books. She records the times and observations in clinical language that sounds like nothing and everything. She knows what these notations mean. She knows what the 7 physicians will do with the word nothing. The colonel sees her write. He sees her glance at his son's face with something that isn't pity. It's recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from someone who has held other people together when the pieces were scattered across concrete. What they didn't know was that Brooke Sullivan had spent 14 hours under direct fire at Bagram's trauma unit, treating combat casualties with nothing but a field surgical kit and morphine she rationed like it was liquid gold. What they didn't know was that her left leg had been rebuilt with titanium and titanium's memory of the blast that took her active service. What they didn't know was that every whisper, every deliberate turn of the head during shift change, every way the physicians treated her like she existed one level below the equipment, she'd learned to absorb it all without a single tremor crossing her face. Composure was its own kind of weapon. She leaves room 347 and moves to the medication cart parked in the hallway outside. The nursing station is empty for approximately 90 seconds. This is the window. The small gap where no one is watching. Brooke opens her locker, a narrow metal box the hospital provided with the scrubs and ID badge and everything a person is supposed to be, and reaches for the jacket she hangs on the hook. The late October morning in San Antonio hasn't warmed yet, and she'll need it during the commute home after the shift ends. As she pulls the jacket down, the movement shifts the lining, and for half a second, less than the time it takes to blink, the faded unit patch becomes visible. Green beret insignia. Black embroidered thread on fabric that has been stitched and restitched by hands that couldn't let it go. She catches it immediately, tucking the patch back into the lining with a movement so quick it could have been imagined. But it wasn't imagined. Dr. Pierce stands at the far end of the hallway, 20 feet away, his white coat pristine as surgical gauze, his expression shifting from casual observation to something harder, something that carries weight like a stone sinking through deep water. His eyes track from the patch back to Brooke's face. She doesn't meet his gaze. She doesn't need to. She can feel the recognition moving through him like current. He washed out of selection 23 years ago. She knows this because everyone at Cedar Creek Medical knows this, the way people know useless facts that carry power. Failed the land navigation course on day 4. Didn't have the heart for it, the instructors said. The military's polite way of explaining that some people look the part but don't survive what the part demands. He became a physician instead, which was fine, respectable, a different kind of competence. But failure leaves a mark, and that mark sees itself in other people, in symbols, in the casual way a nurse tucks a green beret insignia back into her jacket like it's nothing. Like she earned the right to carry it. The hallway seems to contract. Brooke closes her locker without a sound. She doesn't turn to look at him. She moves back toward the nursing station with the same economical grace she uses for everything, one foot in front of the other, spine straight, nothing in her face suggesting that she felt the exact moment his hatred crystallized into something with teeth. By 06:30 hours, Dr. Pierce is reviewing the ICU census with the morning nursing staff. His voice carries its usual edge, academic authority mixed with impatience. He stands in the center of the nursing station, tablet in hand, and begins his round-by-round assessment. When he reaches Dylan Garrett's room, room 347, he pauses. He scrolls through the chart. Brooke's notations are there, time-stamped, documented, incontestable. She stands at the far side of the station, checking for bags on the medication cart, her body language suggesting she is interested in nothing except the drip rates and fluid viscosity in front of her. He moves to stand in Dylan's doorway, and Colonel Garrett looks up. 7 attending physicians have already explained that the prognosis is death. That the paperwork for organ donation can begin. That grief is the only path forward now. The Colonel's eyes are empty as a house where someone died and the doors were locked from the outside. He sees Dr. Pierce and nods, a gesture that carries the weight of gratitude for everything the hospital has done and everything it will stop doing within 48 hours. Pierce's tablet reflects light as he swipes through images. Dylan's CT scans. Brain imaging. Physical examination findings. All of them documenting the catastrophic damage from the IED. All of them leading to the only conclusion that makes sense. All of them saying goodbye. But that wasn't the worst part of what was coming. Brooke finishes her medication rounds and retreats to the back corner of the ICU where the supply closet opens into a small space meant for inventory, not for people. She pulls up Dylan's chart on her phone, the secure access granted because she has clearance, because she is staff, because no one understood yet what that clearance actually meant. She reads the notes from 03:47 hours again. Pupil response. The time. The way she documented it so carefully, each detail a small stone placed in a path that no one else was walking yet. She thinks about Colonel Garrett's hand gripping his son's wrist. She thinks about the way Dylan's body had tensed when the temperature dropped. She thinks about the pediatric trauma cases she'd managed at Bagram, the ones where the body was trying to survive even when medicine said survival was impossible. The body knows things before consciousness remembers them. Muscle memory. Cellular memory. The memory of wanting to live. Dr. Pierce's voice drifts toward her from the nursing station, sharp and dismissive. 7 of us can't be wrong. And Brooke Sullivan, who has seen the worst and learned to give anyway, closes her eyes in that small dark space and begins to prepare for what is coming. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it ended careers. Grand rounds at Cedar Creek Medical began at 8 o'clock sharp every Tuesday morning, 14 medical students and residents forming a semicircle around the bed like tourists at a gallery opening. Dr. Pierce stood at the foot of Dylan Garrett's bed with his tablet glowing, his voice carrying the theatrical certainty of a man who had never been wrong and couldn't afford to start now. Brooke stood 3 feet away, hands at her sides, watching a 9-year-old boy she'd held through the darkest part of the night. Nurse Sullivan here represents a common problem in modern medicine, Pierce began, his gaze sliding toward her like a searchlight. A well-intentioned professional who has developed what we call misguided optimism. He gestured to Dylan's monitor, the gentle rise and fall of the ventilator, the steady percussion of the heart rate climbing across the screen. She believes this patient shows signs of awareness. Signs of recovery. Tell them, Sullivan. Tell them about your miracle cures. The students shifted. Some uncomfortable. Some smirking. Brooke had learned long ago that composure wasn't the absence of feeling, it was the discipline of not letting anyone else borrow yours. She took one measured breath and held her position. The reality, Pierce continued, turning back to his audience, is that nurses without medical degrees often give false hope to families. Dangerous hope. Unprofessional hope. He glanced at Colonel Garrett, who stood rigid at his son's bedside, hands gripping the rail so hard his knuckles had turned white. I apologize that our staff has made this harder for you, Colonel. The truth is, your son's injuries from Bagram are unsurvivable. 7 attending physicians agree. 7. Not one nurse's hunch. The way he said nurse made it sound like a synonym for something smaller. Something that should know its place. Brooke's jaw tightened, just barely. A flicker. Nothing more. The students filed out behind Pierce, and she heard Chen laugh about something as they rounded the corner. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, indifferent to every hierarchy in the room. 3 hours later, at the vending machine outside the break room, Brooke was inserting coins for black coffee when Dr. Chen, Dr. Rodriguez, and Dr. Patel approached from the hallway. They saw her. Their conversation halted mid-sentence. Chen whispered something, Rodriguez glanced away, and all 3 pivoted so smoothly it might have looked like choreography if you didn't know what was really happening. They walked past without acknowledgement, without the coffee they'd originally come for. Their laughter drifted back, low, rehearsed, the sound of people performing loyalty to someone else's cruelty. Brooke selected her coffee. Steady hands. No tremor. No hesitation. The vending machine dispensed the cup with its usual mechanical wheeze, and she held it against her ribs like it was the only warm thing in San Antonio. That afternoon, Pierce found her at the medication cart restocking supplies, precise rows of syringes, bottles aligned like soldiers. He approached from behind, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that didn't fit the man wearing it. His voice came low and deliberate, words shaped like a knife. Let me be crystal clear, Nurse Sullivan. Unauthorized patient advocacy, contradicting physician assessments to families, making claims about neurological responses we cannot verify, will result in immediate termination and a security escort from this building. Are we clear? Brooke turned slowly. Her eyes met his, and she watched something flicker across his face, recognition, maybe, or the shadow of something he'd lost trying to find. His gaze dropped to her locker, still slightly ajar from the morning shift change. The faded unit patch was visible, green and gold, stitched inside the jacket lining where she'd kept it for 8 years. The same patch that had gotten him dismissed from selection at Fort Bragg, the one that was supposed to mean something when you earned it and nothing when you didn't. Pierce's mouth tightened. Brooke took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, and somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm, not an emergency, just the background pulse of a place built to fight death and usually lose. She held his eyes and let one tear trace her cheek, not from fear, not from shame, but from the weight of knowing exactly what he was and exactly what he would do next. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Dylan responds to his father's voice at 0300 hours when you're not watching, she said quietly. Each word placed deliberately, like stones across a river. His pupils dilate. His heart rate decreases. His right hand has begun to track toward auditory stimuli. The scans don't show it because the scans were read wrong. But you already know that. Pierce's jaw clenched. His hand moved to his phone. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the silence was the kind that carries weight, the kind you can feel pressing down on your shoulders. "You're done here," he said, already dialing. "I'm calling security." He walked away, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice dropping into that same theatrical register he used for grand rounds. Brooke stood at the medication cart holding her inventory tray, and she didn't move until she heard his footsteps fade. Then she completed her count, 43 vials of heparin, 21 syringes of morphine, 8 units of insulin. Numbers didn't judge. Numbers didn't lie. But that wasn't the worst part. At 02 for 7 hours, Brooke was completing her rounds on the ICU's opposite wing, checking monitors, adjusting for rates, noting the small details that most people missed. But Dylan's bed was calling to her, some frequency only she could hear. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't authorized. It was just the thing you did when you'd seen what happened at Bagram and learned that protocol was written by people who'd never held someone's skull together with your bare hands. She returned to his room unauthorized. Colonel Garrett was there, of course, reading from a worn paperback, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had lost his wife in the same blast that took his son's ability to respond. He looked up as Brooke approached the monitors. "His intracranial pressure is climbing," Brooke said, checking the readout with professional certainty. "We need to intervene now." "The doctor said," Garrett began. "The doctors aren't here at 3 in the morning, Brooke interrupted gently. She checked Dylan's pupils with a penlight, watching how they responded to light, tracking their movement like she was reading a language only she understood. Fixed. Dilated. The classic pattern of a blown vessel, pressure building behind the eyes, the hematoma expanding with each heartbeat. She pressed the page button for the night resident. Dr. Shaw responded in 3 minutes, which was fast for someone who didn't want to be there. He entered the room like he was walking into a trap. "We need emergency decompression," Brooke said. "Now. Not after another CT. Not when the attending wakes up. Now." "I can't authorize that," Shaw stammered, his voice pitched high with conflict. "Pierce will." Brooke was already moving. She left the ICU without another word, took the stairs to the orthopedics wing 2 at a time, used her access code to unlock the surgical supply, retrieved a sterilized bone drill from the cabinet marked emergency surgical kit. For minutes gone. The drill felt familiar in her hands, not this particular one, but the principle. The weight. The purpose. Colonel Garrett understood before she explained anything. He watched her return with the equipment and prep Dylan's skull, identifying landmarks by touch the way a sculptor might, finding the spaces between bone where pressure could escape. "You've done this before," he said, not a question. The voice of a man who had made peace with impossible choices. "Bagram," Brooke answered. 14-hour siege. 3 mortars on the trauma unit. No neurosurgeon. Just me and a scalpel and people who weren't ready to die. Her hands moved like they'd been doing this for years instead of 8 years ago. The burr hole procedure was something they taught in field medicine courses to soldiers who might need to save their buddies when the hospital was 40 kilometers away and the bleeding wouldn't stop. She'd only done it twice. Both times the patient survived. The bone drill whined like a small animal, and dark blood drained as the pressure released. Dylan's pupils began to respond. The fixed dilation loosened. The color came back. Sinus rhythm steady and strong. Shaw stood frozen, phone in hand, the words finally arriving, "I have to report this." "I know," Brooke said. She documented everything. Timestamp. Procedure. Vitals before and after. Patient response. She wrote it all down in perfect hospital language, the language of people who believed in accountability. The language of people who understood that sometimes the rules existed to protect mediocrity, and sometimes you had to break them to protect life. By 0600, Dr. Pierce arrived to find Dylan stable. Brooke's documentation was complete and uploaded. Shaw's incident report was already filed. And the room went so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside, the first drops of what would become a storm that lasted 3 days. By noon, the calls had started. State Senator Whitmore phoned the hospital board directly, not to discuss Dylan Garrett's case, but to express what he called constituent concerns about nursing protocols at Cedar Creek Medical. He didn't mention Brooke by name. He didn't need to. Pierce had spent 18 holes on the golf course at the Dominion 3 weeks prior, positioning this exact moment, planting seeds about scope creep and liability, about how one ambitious nurse with delusions of competence could expose the hospital to catastrophic litigation. The senator's voice carried the kind of casual authority that comes from 42 years in Texas politics and a Rolodex of hospital board members who donated to his last campaign. The message was crystal clear: investigate the nurse, or we investigate you. By 1400 hours, 2 formal complaints materialized in Brooke's personnel file. Both were dated 3 months prior, June, not September, despite occurring just 36 hours ago. The first cited boundary violations and scope of practice overreach. The second mentioned emotional instability and pattern of concerning behavior. Dr. Martinez from HR delivered them personally, her expression apologetic but firm, her hands trembling slightly as she slid the printouts across the desk. "I don't believe these characterizations," Martinez said quietly, glancing at the doorway. "But the board is taking them seriously." Brooke didn't look down at the fabricated dates. She didn't need to confirm what she already knew. Pierce had activated every ally he possessed, and those allies moved with the precision of people who'd practiced institutional destruction before. By 1600 hours, Dr. Helen Ortega from the Texas Medical Board arrived unannounced. She was sharp, late 50s, steel-gray hair pulled back with the severity of a woman who'd spent her career cutting through hospital politics and medical mythology. She didn't smile during introductions. She set up in the conference room on the 4th floor, her credential folders and state letterhead arranged with military precision. Brooke sat across from her for 90 minutes answering questions about the burr hole procedure, about her training, about the moment she decided to use orthopedic equipment for a neurosurgical emergency. "I observed blown vessel patterns consistent with acute epidural hematoma," Brooke said, her voice level as water. The child's pupils were fixed and dilated. The procedure saved his life. Ortega wrote everything down without expression. The procedure violated 17 hospital protocols, she countered, not looking up from her notes. Nurses don't perform surgical intervention, regardless of outcome. Pierce watched from the doorway, arms crossed, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man whose network was finally paying dividends. That evening, the fluorescent lights in the parking lot cast everything in sickly yellow as Brooke pulled up the original CT scans on her personal tablet before heading inside for the night shift. The images uploaded from the military medical database at Bagram were crystal clear, timestamp 1847 hours local time on the date of the IED strike. Dylan's brain injury showed a specific blast pattern, diffuse axonal injury consistent with explosive detonation at approximately 4 meters distance, with fragmentation vectors matching the documented IED schematic. She'd seen 1,000 trauma cases. She knew blast physics like she knew her own scars. The angle was wrong. The trajectory was impossible for an IED explosion. These injuries came from close-range fragmentation, the kind that resulted from something entirely different. Then she pulled up Dylan's current CT scans, the ones stored on Cedar Creek's imaging system, the ones Dr. Pierce had access to through his administrator credentials. The angles had been altered. The blast vectors had been digitally modified. Someone had systematically changed the injury pattern documentation, erasing the evidence of what really happened on that mountainside in Helmand Province 8 months ago. Brooke's hands remained steady as she scrolled between the original and the altered images. Pain is data. She'd learned that at Bagram during her final rotation before the op orders came down, the final rotation before Naval Intelligence made the call. This was exactly why she'd been placed here. This was exactly why she'd spent 8 months absorbing Pierce's contempt, 8 months watching him position himself as the arbiter of medical authority at Cedar Creek, 8 months documenting his behavior while simultaneously documenting Dylan's recovery that nobody else could see. The boy's mother died in that explosion. The boy survived with injuries that didn't match the official narrative. And someone at Cedar Creek Medical had altered the records to ensure no one would ever investigate further. Someone with administrator access. Someone with connections that reached all the way to a state senator's golf schedule. She understood the trap now. The investigation that was coming wouldn't be about whether she'd violated protocol. It would be about removing her from the hospital before she could examine those altered CT scans formally, before she could submit them through official channels, before the inconsistencies could trigger an actual review from NCIS or Naval Criminal Investigative Service. The fabricated complaints, the state senator's call, the backdated personnel file entries, these were all designed to accomplish one thing: get her terminated before she became a problem. And if she tried to blow her cover, if she tried to go to her handlers and explain that the mission required her to stay, she would be yanked out of Cedar Creek immediately. The investigation would die with her termination. Dylan's case would be closed. The altered CT scans would remain buried in hospital systems and military databases. The real truth about what happened to Colonel Garrett's son would disappear into the same fog that had consumed so many other inconvenient facts over the past 8 months. What they didn't know was that Brooke had spent 3 tours at Bagram. She'd treated the casualties from that same explosion. She'd watched the surgical teams process the data, correlate the injuries with the blast reports, document everything with the obsessive precision of military medicine. She had photographic memory for trauma patterns. And she was looking at a fabrication so obvious that it could only work if the person investigating never thought to compare the military records with the hospital records. Which was precisely why Pierce had chosen Ortega from the State Medical Board instead of requesting a hospital internal review. State investigators didn't have access to classified military databases. The next morning at 0830 hours, Brooke was called to HR. Dr. Martinez sat behind her desk with the expression of someone attending a funeral she didn't deserve. The termination letter was already printed, signatures already affixed, the administrative machinery already grinding forward. Effective immediately, Martinez said, sliding the paper across the desk. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Brooke's eyes didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. She simply reached for the letter, read the official language about termination for cause, and stood. The cardboard box appeared in Martinez's hands like it had been prepared in advance, like everyone in this building had already accepted that she would be gone before her shift ended. She walked past Pierce in the hallway outside HR. He was smiling, not the controlled expression of a man who'd accomplished a strategic goal, but the wide, open smile of someone experiencing genuine satisfaction. His mouth carried the shape of victory. Brooke looked at him for exactly 2 seconds and kept walking. She stopped at her locker on the 4th floor, the one that had held her scrubs and her name badge and the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining for 8 months. The patch was still there, the green beret insignia barely visible against the worn fabric, the symbol of everything Pierce had tried to earn and failed to become. She left it in the jacket and carried the box downstairs. By 14:30 hours, she was walking through the lobby of Cedar Creek Medical in regular clothes, the cardboard box balanced against her hip. Security walked 3 feet behind her, not aggressively, just present, just making sure she didn't stop anywhere, didn't access anything, didn't have any final conversations. The September heat hit her like a wall when the automatic doors opened. Rain was coming. The sky had that particular shade of gray that meant a storm was building somewhere over the Texas Hill Country, one of those autumn systems that would roll in hard and fast and drench everything for 3 days. Her daughter was waiting at home. Her 6-year-old had already missed her yesterday. And Brooke had no cover story that wouldn't expose the entire operation, no explanation that didn't compromise Naval Intelligence's investigation into altered military casualty records. The parking lot was mostly empty. Her truck sat in the same spot it had occupied for 8 months, sun-faded and ordinary, absolutely unremarkable. She loaded the box of belongings into the bed and sat in the cab for exactly 90 seconds with the door open and the engine off. Then she started the truck and drove toward San Antonio in silence, knowing that somewhere in a conference room on the 4th floor of Cedar Creek Medical, a state investigator was reviewing falsified complaints, and a doctor was checking his email for confirmation that the problem had been solved, and a 9-year-old boy was sleeping in a hospital bed that everyone had agreed to stop trying to save. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't do anything about it. The rental house on Maple Street sat exactly where Brooke had left it that morning, 1,520 hours, still and waiting, the way safe houses always felt. Mrs. Chen from next door stood on the porch with Emma's hand in hers, and the moment Mrs. Chen saw Brooke's face, her expression shifted into something like pity. She didn't ask questions. She was the kind of neighbor who understood that some people carried boxes home from places, and some people didn't ask why. Emma broke free and ran toward her mother, 7-year-old legs pumping across the yard with the pure velocity of a child who'd been waiting for dismissal that would never come. "Mommy, why are you home? It's not dinner time." Her voice pitched upward at the end, the way children do when they sense something has tilted wrong in the world before they have words for it. Brooke set the cardboard box down on the kitchen table. 8 months of covert placement. 8 months of obscuring her hand's competence, her mind's precision, her training's depth. The box contained her personal items, a coffee mug from the ICU break room, her hospital badge with her civilian credentials, a jacket she'd bought to fit in, nothing that mattered. Everything that mattered was still in Dylan Garrett's medical file, in the altered CT scans that Dr. Pierce had doctored to hide friendly fire incidents from Bagram, in the conspiracy that stretched beyond Cedar Creek Medical into the Pentagon itself. Emma climbed into the kitchen chair beside the box, small hands reaching toward the edge of it like it might contain answers. "Did you get fired?" she asked in a voice so small it barely registered as human speech. Brooke sat down across from her daughter and the weight of 8 months compressed into her chest with the force of a cardiac arrest. The mission failure. The boy she couldn't save because she'd been terminated. The classified investigation she couldn't blow open without destroying the evidence. The Navy Cross that hung in a shadow box at Naval Base San Diego that nobody in San Antonio knew she'd earned. The 14 hours she'd held Bagram's trauma unit together while mortars walked across the compound and her best friend bled out on the surgical table. The knife work that saved 17 lives and cost her everything she couldn't talk about. She put her arms around her daughter and the tears came like hydraulic pressure releasing from a closed system, silent, unstoppable, the kind that doesn't ask permission. Emma's small hand patted her mother's arm the way children do when they're trying to comfort something too large to understand. "It's okay, Mommy. You're really smart. You help people." The cruelty of that statement, the simple truth of it, made Brooke's shoulders shake. Emma had no idea what her mother actually was. Had no concept that the woman holding her had earned a rank that made general salute. That the hands currently trembling against Emma's back had field-sutured a severed artery with a combat knife at 02 for 7 hours on a night when the power grid failed and all they had was pressure and training and refusal. That Brooke had walked into Cedar Creek Medical not as a registered nurse but as a covert asset tasked with exposing evidence that certain high-ranking officers had falsified casualty reports to hide their own tactical failures. Emma climbed into her lap the way she always did, and Brooke held her and couldn't speak because speaking would mean lying, and lying to her daughter would be the one betrayal she couldn't survive. The box sat on the table like evidence. Mrs. Chen had closed the front door, giving them privacy. Outside, the San Antonio heat pressed against the windows like something alive. At Cedar Creek Medical, Dr. Pierce moved through the ICU with a clipboard and the kind of purposeful stride that belongs to men who've never lost an argument. Behind him came Dr. Reeves, Dr. Thompson, and Father Marks, the ethics committee summoned for the withdrawal of care discussion that would make Dylan Garrett's death official. Merciful. Legal. Necessary. Colonel Garrett stood beside his son's bed in dress uniform, the creases so sharp they looked weaponized. Pierce began his prepared statement with the tone of a man delivering a lecture he'd given 1,000 times. The consensus of 7 attending physicians is that Dylan's injuries are incompatible with consciousness. The brainstem responses we've observed are reflexive only. There is no meaningful recovery trajectory. We recommend withdrawal of life support at 1900 hours to allow him dignity in. Dylan's eyes opened. Not the random fluttering of eyelids under sedation. Not the involuntary brainstem reflexes that Pierce had used for weeks as evidence of neurological death. His pupils contracted with focused intention. His gaze tracked across the room like a targeting system acquiring coordinates. The movement was deliberate. The awareness was unmistakable. His eyes fixed on the ICU doorway, the space where the evening shift nurse should have been standing during change of rounds. The space where Brooke should have been. Colonel Garrett leaned down as his son's cracked lips moved. The words came barely above a whisper, a sound like wind escaping from a sealed compartment. Reaper. One word. Call sign. Identity. The room went quiet the way rooms do when someone has just spoken the name of something that cannot be explained in reasonable terms. Pierce's jaw tightened. He's delirious. Random vocalizations don't indicate. That's a call sign, Colonel Garrett said, and his voice had changed. The grief-stricken father had disappeared. This was a Green Beret commander speaking. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a document folded with military precision. The paper was creased from being carried, held close enough to be read in the dark. Captain Brooke Sullivan. Combat medic. Call sign, Reaper. Pierce's mouth opened and closed. That's impossible. She's a nurse. She doesn't have. The ICU doors opened with a pneumatic hiss. Boot steps on tile. Military cadence. The sound was unmistakable to anyone who'd ever stood in formation, the compressed precision of trained movement, the weight distributed exactly, the audio signature of people who'd walked through killing fields and corridors alike with the same bearing. The nurses at the station stood instinctively. Rodriguez backed away from the monitor. Chen looked up from the medication dispensary. A 2-star general entered flanked by 2 Marines in dress uniform, their movement synchronized like they'd been briefed 5 seconds before entering. The general's rank was visible on his collar, Major General Raymond Torres, USACOM, his face the color of weather and command. His eyes scanned past Pierce entirely, as if the doctor had become something transparent, and fixed on Colonel Garrett with the recognition of one warrior acknowledging another. Colonel, he nodded. Then he turned to the ethics committee, and his presence made the air in the ICU redistribute itself like it was trying to accommodate something larger than the room could hold. I'm Major General Raymond Torres, United States Special Operations Command. He held a folder stamped classified in both red letters. The security markings alone made the chaplain step backward. We're discussing Captain Brooke Sullivan. Pierce found his voice, and it had become smaller than before. There's been a mistake. Brooke Sullivan is a registered nurse. She has no military. Captain Sullivan, General Torres interrupted with the tone of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. United States Navy Medical Corps. He handed the first document to Father Marks, who read it in silence, then looked up at the general with an expression caught between disbelief and the slow recognition of someone who'd just learned they'd been standing next to a saint without knowing it. Rank confirmed by Naval Personnel Command, Torres continued. His voice was even, factual, the way men speak when delivering information that will reorganize someone's entire understanding of reality. Combat medic, 3rd Special Forces Group Support. A Marine lieutenant stepped forward with something held at arm's length like it was precious, a shadow box. Inside, the geometry of a career laid out in metal and ribbon, combat medical badge, Purple Heart with 2nd Strike device, Silver Star, Navy Cross. The highest decoration a non-commissioned officer could earn for valor in combat. The lieutenant spoke without inflection. Decorations earned at Bagram Airfield, September 2019. Captain Sullivan held the trauma unit for 14 hours under direct fire. 17 casualties survived. 0 lost. The residents gathering in the hallway stared. Chen's mouth hung open in a shape of pure astonishment. Rodriguez had moved against the far wall as if magnetized. The attending physicians who'd used Brooke as a teaching example of false hope now stood motionless, their brains attempting to reconcile two versions of her that couldn't coexist. Colonel Garrett's voice came rough now, full of weight that Pierce couldn't measure. Captain Sullivan was my wife's medic. She died despite everything Reaper did. She died, and my son lived, and Reaper never mentioned it once. He looked at Dylan, whose eyes were still open, still focused, still aware in ways that contradicted everything 7 physicians had insisted was neurologically impossible. That was the day Reaper saved him the first time. General Torres spoke with the precision of someone reading from a classified briefing. Captain Sullivan's current assignment is classified under JSOC protocols, but it involves Cedar Creek medical and compromised combat casualty records. He paused, and his eyes moved to Dr. Pierce like a targeting laser settling on coordinates. Record someone at this hospital has been altering to hide friendly fire incidents and command negligence. Pierce's laugh emerged hollow, unconvincing, the sound of a man still operating under the assumption that institutional power functioned the same way everywhere. This is absurd. You can't possibly think, he stopped, something calculating moving behind his eyes. I'll prove it. Her personnel file, her actual credentials. They're in our system. I have administrator access. He moved to the nearby terminal, muscle memory taking over, his fingers moving toward the keyboard with the confidence of someone who'd controlled databases and narrative alike for long enough to believe the control was permanent. Dr. Pierce, an FBI agent said, stepping from behind the Marines. His shield was visible, his face impassive. Please continue. Access those files. Pierce's hands hovered above the keyboard. His eyes moved to the agent, then back to the screen. He typed. The cursor blinked. The database opened, responding to his credentials like always, recognizing him as a user with high-level access, showing him the personnel files he'd spent weeks protecting through redaction and false documentation. The upload bar crawled across the screen, 10%. 40%. The evidence of his own handwriting in the system logs, timestamps that would prove he'd accessed Dylan's CT scans on September 15th, the same day he'd threatened Brooke at the vending machine. 60%. 80%. Pierce's face had gone the color of someone watching their own execution occur in real time. Back at the rental house, Emma had fallen asleep against her mother's chest, her breathing taking on the shallow rhythm of exhaustion and the fundamental safety children feel when held by someone who would spend eternity protecting them. Brooke sat in the darkening kitchen with her daughter's weight a small anchor against the catastrophe of the last 8 hours. The box from her locker sat on the table, its contents meaningless now. Her civilian identity would be terminated by morning. Her covert assignment would be escalated beyond her clearance. The mission would be handed off to someone else, someone whose daughter wouldn't wake up asking why mommy was home. But Dylan would live. The doctors had been wrong. The 7 physicians with their credentials and their protocols had written an obituary for a child whose mother had whispered instructions to her son in the dark before she died, telling him to hold on, telling him that someone called Reaper was coming, that he would see his father again. Dylan had listened in the way children listen to their mothers, with the certainty of someone who knows the voice telling him the truth. Emma slept against her mother's chest, and Brooke pressed her face into her daughter's hair and didn't cry anymore because the worst had already happened, and they'd survived it. 3 days had passed. 72 hours of silence where Brooke Sullivan hadn't answered her phone, hadn't checked her email, hadn't done anything except sit at her kitchen table while Emma colored beside her and asked why mommy looked sad. The rental house in San Antonio had gone quiet in the way houses go quiet when hope has left the building. Brooke's termination papers sat in a folder next to yesterday's unopened mail. Cedar Creek Medical had won. Dr. Pierce had won. 7 attending physicians had circled like wolves and torn her down, and she'd let them, because revealing her true identity would have killed the mission before it started. At 14:47 that same afternoon, Dr. Marcus Pierce walked into room 347 of Cedar Creek Medical's ICU with the hospital ethics committee trailing behind him like he was leading a funeral procession. The room smelled of antiseptic and the chemical staleness of machines that breathed for other people's children. Dylan Garrett lay exactly where he'd been 3 days before, monitors displaying the flat neurological landscape of brain death, his small body hooked to a ventilator that moved his chest up and down with mechanical precision. The boy's father, Colonel Garrett, stood at the window with his arms crossed, jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like ropes. Pierce held a clipboard. His expression carried the weight of judicial authority, the face of a man about to deliver mercy in the form of withdrawal of care. He didn't see the slight flexing of Colonel Garrett's shoulders. He didn't see the way the old soldier was bracing himself for the final goodbye. "We're here to document the family's decision regarding continued life support," Pierce announced, his voice carrying that particular cadence of controlled compassion that people use when they're about to authorize death. Given the extensive neurological testing and the clear prognosis of... Dylan's eyes opened. Not flickered. Not jerked. Opened, pupils dilating, iris contracting, focus crystallizing like someone waking from a long sleep. The eyes moved. Tracked. Found Brooke's face standing in the doorway where she shouldn't have been, the nurse he'd banned from the floor, the one he'd orchestrated out of his hospital. The monitors went wild. Heart rate climbing from 62 to 78 to 94. Oxygen saturation holding steady at 98. Real numbers. Real response. Dylan's mouth moved. His lips formed shapes around the endotracheal tube still anchored in his throat, the ventilator fighting against the effort of his own breathing muscle kicking in. His eyes locked onto Brooke with the kind of recognition that transcends reason. A child recognizing his mother's voice in the dark. A soldier recognizing his unit commander. The whisper came out as barely more than breath against the tube, "Reaper." The room went dead silent. The word hung in the antiseptic air like a bullet hole, visible only because of what it had shattered. Colonel Garrett's hand went to his mouth. Dr. Chen, standing at the foot of the bed, looked from Dylan to Brooke and back again. Pierce's clipboard fell. Brooke didn't move. Didn't react. Her composure was ice water, but her eyes had just become a door opening onto a completely different woman than the timid nurse they'd all believed her to be. Colonel Garrett stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command authority that transcended any hospital hierarchy. He was reaching into the inside pocket of his dress uniform jacket, the one he'd worn to the hospital every single day, pressed and perfect, keeping his bearing intact while his son lay dying. His hands were steady as surgical steel. He unfolded a document that had been classified until 3 seconds ago. Navy Cross citation, Colonel Garrett said, reading from the official seal. For extraordinary heroism. Combat Medic Captain Brooke Sullivan, attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Dark Force. Held Bagram Airfield Trauma Unit for 14 continuous hours under direct fire after the initial IED strike. 42 casualties processed. 38 salvageable. 0 preventable deaths under her care. He looked up from the citation. His eyes were red. She held my wife's hand while the medevac helicopter was coming. Held my wife's hand while telling her Dylan would be okay. Dylan was still in utero. My wife was DOA at Landstuhl. But she made sure Dylan knew his mother's voice before she died. The door burst open. A 2-star general in dress blues entered the room with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. Major General Raymond Torres, Special Operations Medical Command, didn't walk so much as arrive, each footstep a decision, each breath a command. Behind him, 2 FBI agents in dark suits positioned themselves on either side of the door frame. Watching. Recording. General Torres approached Brooke and rendered a salute, crisp, sharp, the kind of salute that meant respect, not ritual. Captain Sullivan. Brooke returned the salute. Her voice, when she spoke, had dropped an octave since the morning she'd been escorted out by security. The timid nurse was gone. What remained was command authority. "Sir." Torres gestured, and an aide produced a small wooden box lined with blue velvet. Inside, medals caught the harsh ICU lighting, the silver star gleaming like captured moonlight, and alongside it, 2 purple hearts that looked like they'd been to hell and back. Because they had. Silver Star for Valor under fire, Torres said, placing the first medal into Brooke's palm. Purple Heart for wound sustained. The second. Purple Heart for wound sustained on a second deployment. The third rested in her hand like it weighed 1,000 pounds. 8 months of service at Cedar Creek Medical while conducting an intelligence investigation into the destruction of evidence related to the Bagram incident. Your cover is compromised. Your mission integrity is secured. This hospital protected something that needed protecting, and someone in that hospital tried to bury it. Pierce had gone absolutely white. The color had drained from his face like someone had opened a drain plug in his chest. He was backing toward the door, but the FBI agents shifted their positions, casual, unhurried, blocking the exit. Those credentials are fabricated, Pierce said. His voice had developed a tremor he couldn't suppress. This is some kind of elaborate, she's a nurse. A psychiatric nurse with delusions of. Pull up the personnel database, the FBI agent said. Not a question. A command. Show us your access logs for the past 8 months. Pierce's eyes darted toward the nurse's station computer. His fingers actually twitched. He was calculating whether to run, whether to deny, whether to call his lawyer or that state senator or anyone who might still have power in a world that was dissolving around him in real time. He walked to the computer. The FBI agent stood beside him, notebook open, pen poised. A second agent positioned himself so he could see the screen. Pierce's hands trembled as he entered his administrator credentials, the passwords that gave him access to personnel files, medical records, imaging systems, the digital infrastructure of the entire hospital. The agent leaned in. Pull up Colonel Garrett CT scans from September 15th. Pierce navigated. Files opened. He tried to smile, tried to deploy that condescending expression that had carried him through decades of hierarchy. See? Perfectly normal documentation. Standard IED fragmentation patterns. The imaging supports the initial diagnosis of. Pull up the raw DICOM files, the agent said. Pierce's hand stopped. I don't have authorization to. You accessed them 17 times between September 15th and March 3rd. Your login credentials are timestamped. Your IP address is logged. Your modifications are documented in the file metadata. The agent's voice carried the quality of someone describing inevitable physics. You altered 43 CT scans over an 18-month period. Removed evidence of friendly fire. Removed evidence of command negligence. Removed evidence of your own medical judgment failure in the initial triage assessment. Pierce closed the browser window. The gesture was almost mechanical, someone operating on pure panic reflex. I want my lawyer. The FBI agent nodded to his partner, who produced handcuffs and read Pierce his rights in the measured, administrative tone of someone following a procedure they'd followed 100 times before. The cuffs clicked onto Pierce's wrists, hard metal against the pale undersides of his arms, and suddenly Dr. Marcus Pierce wasn't a senior attending physician anymore. He was a suspect. He was evidence. He was finished. They walked him out of the ICU. Past the medication cart where he'd threatened Brooke with security escorts and fired warnings about unauthorized patient advocacy. Past the vending machine where he'd stood 3 days before and told her unauthorized advocacy would result in termination. Past the break room where 7 attendings had turned their backs while she stood alone with a cup of lukewarm coffee and the knowledge that she was expendable. Dr. Shaw stood at the nursing station with his mouth hanging open. Dr. Chen had tears streaming down her face. Rodriguez was whispering "Oh my God" over and over, the words becoming a prayer or a curse or both at once. The residents who'd shunned Brooke, who'd walked past her at the vending machine like she was invisible, who'd crossed the hallway to avoid her in the corridor, they watched in absolute silence. At the elevator, Pierce made one final attempt at reclamation. I'm a physician. I have standing in this community. Senator Whitmore will hear about this. I have connections that. The FBI agent pressed the elevator button. Senator Whitmore is currently being interviewed about his role in pressuring the hospital board to accelerate your investigation timeline and suppress evidence of investigation. Enjoy the ride. The doors closed on Pierce's white face and the sound of the cuffs clicking against the elevator railing as he descended. Back in room 347, General Torres turned to Colonel Garrett and nodded once, the gesture of one warrior acknowledging another across a field where the battle was finally over. "Your son is breathing on his own," Torres said, looking at the monitors where Dylan's oxygen saturation had stabilized at 98% and his heart rate had normalized to a steady, beautiful rhythm. The neurological response is consistent with emergence from deep sedation. He's going to need rehabilitation. Therapy. Time. But he's going to make it. Colonel Garrett gripped Brooke's shoulder with the kind of pressure that meant gratitude beyond language. She kneeled beside Dylan's bed, and the boy reached for her with the fingers of a child who'd just woken from a nightmare and needed to know the nightmare was over. She didn't cry. Didn't shake. Held steady as the boy's small fingers traced the green beret patch on her chest, his mother's patch, the one that had hung in this hospital as evidence of everything his mother had believed in and everything she'd died protecting. "Welcome back, buddy," Brooke whispered. "Welcome home." The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and proven everyone wrong, or if you know someone who has, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's hear your stories. Because the real heroes aren't always the ones in uniforms. Sometimes they're the ones in scrubs, holding the line when the world stops watching.